Welcome, everybody, here in person and via Zoom. My name is Bruce Maggot, and I am the Dean of the Agino School of Business and the incoming Provost at Golden Gate University. And welcome to the Golden Gate University Agino School of Business and Innovation and Practice series. Huxley and I were talking before, and now we're good friends, and he said I can just say welcome back, Huxley. And with his new presentation, Failure is Just the Beginning. And in 2021, Huxley's presentation, Building on the Shoulders of Failure, explored fascinating failures, quote unquote, from computer and consumer electronics history, which were unexpectedly important, influential, and impactful on the modern world. Something to really think about. We were looking back at some of these machines. So today we are pleased that he has graciously agreed to return again with his lovely partner, who's also with us, with actual devices here in the library to continue to look at the most influential failures, flops, and disasters in tech history. So please join me in welcoming Huxley. Huxley, it's all yours. Thank you.
All right, well, here goes nothing. I'm going to begin by just acknowledging, like a lot of folks, I've been hammered by allergies this week. So if I have to step away for a moment, it's okay. The show will go on. Audio is coming through okay. And yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So to begin with, I want to answer maybe the easiest question to knock out at the start here. My wife Sarai and I, we call ourselves these presentations that we like to do. We call them the Retro Roadshow. But what does that mean? What is the Retro Roadshow? And the simple answer is, I'm a nerd. She's a nerd. We made a nerd. And I've been collecting all this old vintage tech stuff since I was a kid, since I was younger than our son is now. I'm fascinated by vintage technology. And I've been collecting a lot of this stuff for a long time, many decades at this point. And rather than just letting all this stuff sit in a storage locker collecting dust, we want to get out in the world and let people learn about these fascinating, important historical artifacts that really did play sometimes overlooked or forgotten roles in shaping the world that we all live in. So today, that's what we're going to explore. And at our other events that we've done around the Bay Area, that's kind of the theme of what we're all about. So on to the topic of the day, as the Dean graciously introduced. This is a presentation that we're calling Failure is Just the Beginning, in which we're going to explore some of the most interesting and impactful failures and disasters from tech and business history. We're going to look at 4 of these stories over the course of the next hour or so. And I want to start by acknowledging something right off the bat. I'm going to use this word failure a lot in the next hour. But I'm using that word very specifically. I'm using it very intentionally. Failure is a harsh word. I don't think anybody likes being called a failure. Certainly nobody likes something that they've put their heart and soul and blood, sweat, and tears into being called a failure. But essentially what we're going to be talking about in this presentation are items, products, concepts that were born of good intentions, created by smart, driven people doing their very best to make something amazing. And every one of these stories is going to highlight an example where all those best intentions and efforts didn't work out the way anybody anticipated or would have wanted. But these are really success stories. These are stories of hidden victories that you just have to look a little closer to find. So that's kind of the way I'm using failure here is clickbait. The real story here are the successes. There we go. So chapter 1, the story of the Osborne Computer Corporation. And for the folks who are in the room with us, we have a whole table of vintage equipment set up. It's all humming along over there. So far, nothing has burst into flames. We'll see. Everybody cross your fingers. And the machine closest to me is an Osborne portable. So we'll be talking about everything that we talk about during this presentation. And for the folks in the room with us, you'll be invited over to actually spend some time with these exhibits in person. But let's go ahead and jump in here. Let's talk for a few minutes about the Osborne Computer Corporation and its namesake, this gentleman named Adam Osborne. Adam Osborne is, in my mind, honestly, I think he's one of the most fascinating people that very few people ever talk about anymore. He was born in 1936 in Thailand. He was born to British and Polish parents. So he spent part of his childhood in Thailand before moving back to England. And then he came to the US to earn his doctorate in chemical engineering in the 1960s. And while he was pursuing his doctorate, he had his first opportunity to spend time with computers. And of course, in the 1960s, computers were the size of the room we're in now. They were massive, enormous, complicated mainframes that took a team of scientists and engineers to operate. And Adam Osborne saw a lot of potential in the idea of information technology, but he pretty quickly figured out that if computers were always the size of a building, the potential was going to be very limited right off the bat. So in 1972, he started his own publishing company, and he published a mix of books, some of which he brought in from other authors and some of which he wrote himself. He actually wrote what is generally believed to be the first computer how-to book aimed at beginners. He published it in 1973, 74, and it was the first time anybody had essentially published a work saying computers can make everybody's lives better if everybody knew how to use them. That book went on to sell 300,000 copies in the mid-70s and was one of the works cited by Bill Gates and Paul Allen when they decided to start a little shop called Microsoft, you might have heard of. In 1975, Adam Osborne came out to the Bay Area and he started hanging out at this informal gathering that used to happen in the South Bay that was called the Homebrew Computer Club. And it's just what it sounds like. It was a bunch of nerds and academics getting together down in various places, coffee shops and cafeterias where they could get some space. And they were just hanging out. They were all excited about the idea of computers, but very few of them had access to them. But at those homebrew computer clubs meetings in Menlo Park and San Jose and other places, Adam Osborne started circulating with people whose names you may be more familiar with. People like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who were members of that club. He was hanging out with Lee Fellenstein, who was an important engineer. We'll talk more about him in a moment. He was hanging out with Jerry Lawson, a terribly overlooked important figure in entertainment history. Jerry Lawson invented the video game cartridge, and he was hanging out at the homebrew meetings too. So Adam Osborne got really fired up. He was picking up that something was happening. Something was going on. People, smart people, were starting to see potential in computers. And a couple of years later, he becomes really fixated on this vision that computers could change the world. Computers could change everything if they were affordable, if they were easy to use, and if they were portable. And again, this is an era when most computers were the size of a VW bus at best. So this was a pretty groundbreaking vision. So in 1980, he starts his own company fixated on this idea that computers should be easy for everybody to get a hold of and useful and workable for somebody who isn't a computer scientist, and they should be portable. So he partners with that gentleman I mentioned a moment ago, Lee Fellenstein, who is still around. He still lives in the East Bay. And they created this machine that's on the table here called the Osborne 1. It was the world's first mass-produced portable computer. And it hit all three of those marks that Osborne was focused on. It was relatively affordable. It launched at just under 1,800 bucks. But that 1,800 bucks got you not only a computer, it got you over $1,000 of useful software that was included. This was the first computer ever offered to the general public that came with useful software and came with books that told you how to use it. And it was small enough that you could wedge it under an airplane seat, which sounds kind of funny now. Like most of us have a supercomputer in our pocket, but the idea that you could take a useful computer, stick a handle on it and lug it around with you on a trip or take it to work and home and back. This was revolutionary stuff in 1981. So the early reviews of the Osborne 1 were very, very, very positive. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. There wasn't even really language to explain what was happening here. The Osborne 1 became an overnight success. They were selling them faster than they could make them. And the company started growing so quickly that business and academic people had to start inventing new terminology to explain what was going on over at Osborne. So that's where the term hypergrowth came from. Nobody had ever seen a company grow as fast as Osborne grew. In a year and a half, they went from 2 guys in a proverbial garage to 3,000 employees and $73 million in recurring revenue. Like crazy, crazy scale in a year and a half. Like that's kind of mind-boggling. The success of the Osborne One did not go unnoticed by other companies and other innovators. And so within a year or two, the market was being flooded by other comparable, similar looking luggable computers, suitcase-sized machines. K-Pro is a well-known one. I think I heard that name come up earlier. IBM had one. The IBM PC was already a landmark device at that time. We'll talk more about that machine in a little bit. IBM launched their own portable computer that looks so much like an Osborne One, you'd easily mistake them if you saw them sitting side by side. And Compaq, who is not so much a player today, but for 25, 30 years, Compaq was a giant of the computer world. Their first product was an Osborne clone that just was IBM compatible instead of being Osborne compatible. So another way to think about the insane success of the Osborne company, their original business plan, you can find copies of it, it floats around online. They were really optimistically projecting at the launch of this computer. They said over the roughly 5-year life that we think this computer will be on the market, we think we could sell up to 10,000 of them. It's a lot of computers in 1981. The actual sales were 60,000 in the first year, and they could not keep up with demand, which for somebody like me and my wife Sarai has made things very challenging because they were cranking these things out so fast. You could buy a dozen Osborne Ones on the same day, and they'd all have different cases, different keyboards, different monitors, different floppy drives, and different logic boards, because they were just gobbling up parts from any vendor they could, just trying to keep up with demand. It was a runaway success. But they wouldn't be in this presentation if things went perfectly and we were all using Osborne phones today, but that's not the case, of course. So in 1982, Adam Osborne did something that honestly I could see myself doing. He got real nervous about all these competitors coming on the market with look-alike computers. So he called a bunch of journalists and said, you guys, you like the Osborne One, you won't believe what we're cooking up next. It's going to be better, smaller, faster, cooler software, bigger screens. And that made a lot of sense to him. You got to get people excited about the future of your company, right? Not so much. Because what happened was those journalists did what journalists do. They wrote about what Osborne was saying. And so the rumors of new and improved Osborne computers that weren't out yet made it to the Osborne dealer network. And they said, well, why the heck would we keep buying Osborne Ones if there's a whole new raft of machines just around the corner? So they stopped ordering Osborne Ones. Customers heard about this, stopped buying Osborne Ones. They went from selling these things faster than they could make them to thousands of them in piles and warehouses all over the world in the space of days. It was insane how fast this happened. So yeah, you can kind of see the timeline here. Within months of the rumors reaching the dealer network, the orders for the existing product line had evaporated. Their revenue went from $73 million a year to negative millions of dollars almost overnight, and the company was gone within months. They didn't exist anymore. So they were unable to recover from that mistake of hyping unannounced, unreleased products while they were still relying on the revenue from their existing product line. It's such an easy thing to see in hindsight, 2020 vision, it's easy to see. But in those days, nobody had ever made this mistake before, so nobody knew it was a mistake. So where does that leave us? There are some really important lessons from this story that we can all kind of think about in the context of our modern world. First off, Adam Osborne was a pioneer. He was absolutely filled with this passion for democratizing computers. He wanted computers out of giant mainframe buildings and into everybody's living room. He wanted a computer under every airplane seat, and he would probably be very happy to see us all with smartphones today. He accurately predicted and understood that portable computing, portable computing was what would change the world the most immediately for the most people. It's not enough to make a computer that looks great on a desk. It changes everything when you can take it with you. He also understood something that nobody else in the industry had figured out at that time, that selling a whiz-bang gadget is meaningless if it doesn't come with software that lets you do something useful, do something creative, do something impactful. Hardware alone doesn't matter. It's the software that matters. And that's kind of an interesting thing for somebody to say who was egotistical enough to name the company after himself and slap his name on the side of every piece of hardware. But he understood software is really what matters. And so he included it with the computer. And lastly, his mistake of openly discussing unannounced, unreleased products became a business principle that I'm reasonably confident has probably been taught in this building more than once. It's this thing called the Osborne effect. And I appreciate the wisdom of this lesson. And it also bums me out a little that the only time you ever hear about Adam Osborne is dunking on his big mistake, when he was in fact an incredibly important person who helped lay a foundation for the world that we all live in. But nevertheless, when people talk about Adam Osborne, they talk about this effect, the unintentional sabotaging of your own company when you discuss unreleased, unannounced products that aren't ready for market. And I really want to stress this. I worked for Apple for a long time, and I've worked for other big tech companies in the years since then. If you think that the billion-dollar executives who live and work everywhere around us have forgotten this lesson, you're wrong. Think about the big announcement a couple of days ago, the Apple Vision Pro, the headset that we'll all be living in the future. That is a product that people were speculating about for years, but nobody knew for sure anything about it until the moment Tim Cook walked on stage and was ready to announce it, because Apple and every other smart tech company knows not to make the mistake Osborne made. As much of a pioneer as he was, this is the lesson that a lot of folks have taken from his story. So that's the story of Adam Osborne and the Osborne One. When we're done with the presentation, I'm going to invite everybody to come up. I hope you all brought your magnifying glasses so you can read the microscopic text on that itty bitty little screen. So let's move on to chapter 2. And chapter 2 is about the Apple III. It's a seriously flawed computer for doing serious business. So we touched on this a little bit because all of these stories we're talking about, they're all intertwined. You're going to hear a lot of the same names weaving around in these stories. 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne, the mostly forgotten third co-founder of Apple, they started this little company down in the South Bay. They started selling what became known as the Apple I. It was a single creation. It was a circuit board. You could go down to the bike shop in Palo Alto, pay your $666.66, go home with a circuit board, and then you'd have to figure out what to do with it. And it was a circuit board that Steve Wozniak designed with one specific purpose: to impress his pals at the homebrew club, because he thought they'd get a kick out of it. But Steve Jobs was a smart, clever guy, and he said, hey, if it's good enough to impress the nerds at the homebrew club, it's probably good enough for people to want to buy. So Jobs turned it into a product. They were selling Apple I's, but it didn't really become a product until a year or so later when they released the Apple II, which was a bigger, better, faster, more capable version of that same circuit board. But with Jobs's marketing genius applied to it, he knew that selling a bare circuit board was always going to keep most people away. So he had the clever insight to put that circuit board into a really attractive case with a built-in keyboard and a power supply included, and all the things you need to actually get started using it. The Apple II was a really big hit. People loved the Apple II. It's considered 1/3 of the holy trinity of personal computing. It was the Apple II, the TRS-80, and the Commodore PET. Those were the three computers that kicked off the entire computing revolution that we're all still working through right now. So the Apple II shot Apple straight into that same hypergrowth phase that we just learned about from the Osborne company. And of course, Apple blew up. They're still going strong, obviously. And at the same time, they were struggling in a way. They were struggling because they were selling Apple IIs as fast as they could make them, but their customers were very heavily skewed towards home users, consumers, and educators. Schools were buying Apple IIs by the truckload, but Apple had no credibility with the business world. And in those days, in the late 70s, early 80s, if you thought of yourself as a computer company, you needed business customers to be a viable company because there really was no such thing as a market for consumer computers. So they were really, really nervous about missing out on business customers. And in those days, when you thought about business, you thought 3 letters, IBM. IBM had been around for 70 years or something at that point. They were the International Calculating and Tabulating Company before they shortened that a little bit. And they became an incredibly dominant force in computing because they were the people primarily making those giant mainframes that Adam Osborne was rebelling against. IBM made bajillions of dollars selling very beautifully color-coded mainframe computers to offices that looked like the set of Mad Men, and they became the dominant vendor of those kinds of computers. IBM was synonymous with computing for 25, 30 years. In 1979, Apple was like rocket shipping into the stratosphere on the success of the Apple II. But again, they didn't have confidence that that could keep going indefinitely because, again, everybody knew to be a real player in the personal or in any kind of computing business, you had to go after businesses. So Apple became very fixated on this concept that they needed to appeal to business customers. And everybody in the microcomputer business at that time was really nervous because the rumor mill was going crazy that IBM was about to add a microcomputer to their product line. And with all of their credibility and with their vast dealer network, it was pretty much assumed that the moment IBM dropped any kind of a microcomputer, it would take over and become the only platform anybody cared about. So everybody was really nervous about this. So in 1978, when the IBM rumor mill was swirling and Apple was really still a very young company, they were 2 years, 3 years old at this point, they hired this gentleman, Dr. Wendell Sander, and they hired him to be their first chief product scientist, essentially. And they gave him a very challenging task. We want you, Dr. Sander, to develop an Apple computer that will be a must-have for business customers. It's a big challenge. They wanted this computer, which they codenamed Sarah. Sarah was Wendell Sanders' daughter, so they codenamed the machine Sarah. They wanted Sarah to launch 8 to 10 months after they started the project. They were really, really hoping to beat IBM to the market for a business-oriented microcomputer. They thought they had a good chance at this. But again, Apple was a very immature company in a very immature industry. And so feature creep and design by committee started to kick in. Feature creep is something anybody who's worked in tech has probably heard of. It's the idea that every time somebody comes up with a good feature, great, put it on the to-do list. And that list just gets longer and longer and longer. So over the development cycle for Sarah, this new computer, they really succumbed to feature creep and they really succumbed to design by committee. The perfect example of that is the marketing team at Apple was part of the design team of this computer. You really don't want marketing people designing your hardware. It's usually a recipe for disaster. So over the course of the development of this computer, they developed a new operating system, brand new hardware that nobody had ever built before, whole new capabilities nobody had conceived of before, a whole new software development platform, new accessory line, a whole new industrial design. They had to build a whole new assembly line to build these things. New, everything was new. And every one of those was a million more items on the to-do list. So not surprisingly, when this machine finally launched, Sarah was a beast of a computer. It dropped in 1980, late 80, early 81, which was still 2 years later than they wanted. But it came out with some of the most powerful specs of any computer that had been released to this point. So it was almost twice as fast as an Apple II. It could hold up to 8 times as much memory as an Apple II. It had built-in floppy drive in an era when that was always an optional accessory you'd pay hundreds of dollars to get. It had built-in support for hard drives, which was a technology most people had never even heard of at that point. The Apple III, what we call Sarah, was only partially compatible with Apple II software and hardware accessories. It ran a brand new operating system called the Apple Sophisticated Operating System, which everybody called applesauce for short. And when it launched at a price that was reasonable for business customers with deep pockets. So if you ran out to buy yourself a shiny new Apple III in 1981, you'd be spending somewhere between $4,300 to $7,800. But to translate that to current dollars, when you account for inflation, that's a starting price of $16,000 before you add any software, before you add a monitor or a printer. And then depending on how much memory and accessories you want, you could easily spend 30 grand on an Apple III, easily. So you can probably see where this story is headed. The Apple III, aka Sarah, was a troubled product from the moment it came out. It was 2 years late, but that was still rushed to market. And so they didn't have enough time to iron out a lot of the kinks in the hardware. So one example of that was the very advanced motherboard in that machine was like a radio station. It would blast RF interference. You know who doesn't like RF interference? The Federal Communications Commission, who immediately launched multiple investigations of Apple, started levying enormous fines against them. It was also only partially compatible with the Apple II. And that maybe doesn't sound like a big deal, but you have to believe it was a big deal because a large number of Apple's customers who would have considered buying an Apple III might have already invested in Apple II hardware or software, or they might be looking at Apple II stuff and realizing it's a lot cheaper than what Apple's selling with the III. Maybe the greatest flaw of all, the beautiful case that you see it in there. It's big and heavy and kind of neat looking, very 1970s looking. It's also really thick die cast aluminum, which was a new milling technology Apple invented for this machine, but that also meant it was really warm. It's a great way to trap heat. And so the Apple III would overheat. And what does an electronic circuit board do when it gets too hot? It warps and bends and flexes, which would cause the Apple III to crash or do weird, unpredictable things. So Apple had to do the one thing no product company ever wants to do. They had to recall all of them, all 14,000 that they sold in the first, whatever, 6, 8, 10 months of it being on the market. They all had to go back to Apple for redesigned logic boards that would circumvent the FCC radio interference problem and would run cooler so that it wouldn't warp and overheat. It was an enormous scandal. It was a huge blow to Apple's brand. Apple today is the most trusted, most respected, and most valuable company in the world. But Apple in 1980, 81, they were the new kid on the block. They didn't have a lot of credibility to burn. And the Apple III was an albatross. It was a disaster of a product. So in 1983, they tried to save the product line. They re-released it with that new and improved logic board that didn't put out as much radio noise and didn't get as hot. They cleverly found a loophole in the FCC laws that they were violating. They didn't call it the Apple III anymore. Now it was the Apple III Plus. It's the first Apple product to get the Plus name stuck on the end of it. But by renaming it, now it's a new product that the FCC couldn't keep finding them for the old one. Nevertheless, customers basically ignored the Apple III. It was a dead product within days of its launch, and all of their efforts to resurrect it were not enough to save this sinking ship. 1985, they quietly discontinued it. It was the first product Apple ever announced that they didn't announce being retired in favor of something better, newer, faster. It was just done away with. They took it out back. And over the course of its very short 3-4 year lifespan as a product, Apple sank over $100 million into the Apple III as a platform in an era when $100 million was a lot of money. And at its best, at the very peak of the Apple III's success, it never accounted for more than 3% of Apple's revenue. And at its ultimate concluding chapter, They never sold more than 120,000 of these things. Now, to put that into context, the Apple II, the machine that Apple had assumed was dying and needed to be replaced by this newer, bigger, better, faster machine, the Apple II ran for another 16 years as a continuously popular product. They sold over 6 million Apple IIs by the time it was finally retired in 1993. So the Apple III is a flawed masterpiece at best. It's a really interesting example of some of the things that you don't want to do when you're rolling out a new product. Despite all of its flaws, the Apple III was a triumph of engineering in its day, even with those flaws accounted for. It introduced concepts that very quickly became things that every serious computer buyer would take for granted as must-have essential things. It was the first Apple product and the first microcomputer available to the mass market that had built-in storage, that had high-resolution text modes. It had fonts that you could change, which sounds incredibly basic today, but in those days, the font you got was the font that came with your computer, and if you didn't like it, wait 5 years and buy another computer. So the idea of switchable fonts was a big deal in 1982, 1981. The Apple III introduced the idea of standardized ports on the back of the machine that you could connect to any modem and connect it to other computers. So this was a pioneer in what we now think of as the internet. It was also the first widely available microcomputer that had built-in support for hard disks, which again was bleeding edge technology at that point. And it was the first easily available computer that had a menu-based operating system and an operating system that supported the concept of folders that you could put files inside, or folders inside of folders inside of folders, what they call a hierarchical file system. So it was an absolute disaster for Apple. The Apple III was an unmitigated flop. There's no nice way to say it, but I do think it's an overlooked triumph in the sense that it introduced concepts that we're all still benefiting from today. So you might not like the Apple III, and I certainly wouldn't encourage anybody to run out and buy one today, but it is deserving of some respect for the role that it played in changing what people expected their computer to offer out of the box. Whew. All right, next chapter. Chapter 3 is about one of my favorite companies that very few people have ever heard of. General Magic. General Magic. This is a really interesting story. So, like a lot of these stories, this story begins in Apple. In 1981, Steve Jobs, being the driven, product-focused, maniacal dude that he was, he heard about some folks inside Apple cooking up some neat ideas, and he took over that project. And that is what became the Macintosh. He assembled this dream team of what were known to be not just the best engineers and designers at Apple, but the best in the world. He was a charismatic person. He was able to suck people into his orbit. And so he pulled in this dream team of the best of the best of the best designers, computer scientists, artists, and they created the Macintosh. And 3 years later, the Macintosh debuted. It was somewhat successful, grew into a successful product line, but that original core group, the original Macintosh dream team, they got kind of itchy. They got real tired of just designing next year's Macintosh over and over and over again. So that original core group of people from the dream team, they started their own project within Apple that they called Project Paradigm. It was all very hush-hush, very top secret. People would whisper in the halls of Cupertino, "Don't talk about Project Paradigm." And Project Paradigm then became spun out of Apple as a wholly owned subsidiary, and then later as its own independent company that they called General Magic. And that original dream team, the Project Paradigm team, who later became the founding team at General Magic, they were focused on one really interesting idea, very reminiscent of stuff Adam Osborne was into. They were imagining a pocket-sized, touch-sensitive device. Now, this is a sketch that was rescued from some archives that Apple intended to destroy, and some folks that I've been in touch with online managed to save some of these sketches. This is a sketch from 1988, envisioning a pocket-sized touch computer that you would use your finger to interact with. If that doesn't look familiar to you, I don't know where you've been for the last like 15 years. So these early sketches from the project paradigm and early General Magic timeframe, they really give you an insight into how big and how forward this team was thinking in 1989, 1990. They imagined a device that you would operate with your fingertip or a stylus. They imagined that it would have a built-in high-resolution camera that you could use to take photographs or scan documents at high res. They imagined that it could easily sync with the other devices in your life, typically a desktop computer. They imagined that it could pull in data and information from a variety of sources. And most interestingly, most importantly, they imagined all of this magic happening because it could be connected to some kind of magical, always-on connection to everything else in the world. So here's another way that you can kind of think about what they were picturing. This is Mark Parat. He's one of that, a member of that dream team that launched General Magic. And he was saying in 1990, what they were envisioning would be a tiny computer and a phone. It's a very personal object. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to give you the kind of satisfaction holding it and owning it that you would get in holding or owning a fine piece of jewelry or really well-made watch. It would have value even when you're not using it. And once you've used it once, you'd never want to live without it again. Now, I don't know if any of you guys are as obsessed with your phone as I am, but he was describing my relationship with my smartphone today, and he was describing that in 1990. That's kind of amazing when you think about it. So fueled by that really creative idea, this company, General Magic, they take flight, they get going. They spend 2.5 years operating under strict top secrecy. Again, learning lessons from Adam Osborne. Don't talk about stuff until you're ready to sell it. They formed partnerships with some of the biggest names in the world for consumer electronics and technology products. And everybody was buzzing. What is General Magic up to? And fueled by this rampant speculation about what these brilliant people who had already changed the world with the Macintosh, what they might be cooking up next, General Magic became the first company in history to go public and have an IPO without ever having sold anything and without ever having made $1 in revenue. That, I mean, people talk about hype today. That is some wild hype. And the company doubled in value 24 hours after the IPO. Like this is crazy. People talk about the dot-com bubble. The dot-com bubble got their inspiration from General Magic. They were effectively designing the future that we all live in today. And they had all of these different projects and ideas and daydreams. But over those 2.5-ish years of development, all these ideas started to kind of fall into 3 big columns. The first one is an operating system called Magic Cap. It's cute. It was designed, the visuals were designed by Susan Kare, who is another name like Adam Osborne, who fundamentally changed the world. Everybody in this room and everybody on Zoom, I hope you all know the name Susan Kare. She is the artist who was hired by Steve Jobs to design all of the iconography and fonts for the original Macintosh. She left with the dream team, went to General Magic and designed this interface for a handheld computer that you'd operate with your finger, and it's inviting, it's beginner friendly. You don't need a 5-inch thick manual to understand what it is. It's your desk, it's where you do your work. They also designed this concept called Telescript. It was a software development platform, a concept, a framework for developing software that would let low-powered devices push data out and pull data in, push an application out, pull the results back in. In other words, they invented what we now call cloud computing. And they invented the term cloud computing because they were struggling to find a way to explain what this was all about. So the term cloud computing was born at General Magic. And then lastly, they had a clever idea. They knew that they were really good at creating amazing software, but they weren't necessarily eager to become a hardware company. So instead, what they did was they said, here's an amazing operating system, and here's all these capabilities with Telescript. here's what we think the hardware to run it ought to look like. Hey, Sony, hey, Matsushita, hey, Panasonic, how about you guys build devices that just run our software? If that sounds familiar to you, it's maybe because you've heard of Android. It's the same business model, but 15 years, 20 years earlier. Now, as you might imagine, General Magic is in this presentation for the saddest of all reasons. Things did not go the way they had anticipated. All of these big brain ideas, all this crazy future thinking that they were engaged in was amazing. They were cooking up ideas left and right, ideas after ideas. But when you have that many ideas and everybody is free of any form of rigid management, you get no focus. Nobody could focus on any one thing long enough to turn it into anything. There's a great documentary about General Magic that came out a couple of years ago. I really encourage you guys to watch it. It's great. And multiple people who worked there all used the same phrase to describe what it was like. The inmates were running the asylum at General Magic. Anybody who had a good idea would just go off and work on that good idea. The other problems were also really challenging. The first hardware that shipped to run their platform, their Magic Cap and Telescript platform, the first hardware came from Sony. They were their marquee hardware partner. But Sony and General Magic, they had wildly different working styles. Sony is a rigorous, disciplined company grounded in Japanese product management philosophy, and General Magic was the inmates running the asylum. And so Sony got to a point where they said, the hardware is done. We are shipping it. If you've got software, you better give it to us now because the trucks are leaving. And so when these devices left the Sony factories, there was a big gulf between what the hardware was designed for and what General Magic was trying to do, which made the devices really sluggish. And for the folks in the room, you'll get to learn what I'm talking about because we have one sitting on the desk right there. It's beautiful, it's cool, and it runs very, very slowly, which led to the general public getting a very poor impression of all of this General Magic stuff. Oh, it was just hype after all. It's too slow to be useful. At the same time that they were struggling to get a useful product onto the market, their old bosses at Apple had seen the potential of what General Magic was doing and said, you know what, that's actually a pretty good idea. Maybe we should do a handheld computer too. So they developed a completely separate platform called the Apple Newton, which I own. I love my Newton, and it's got its own problems too. When the Newton came out, it was notorious for poor handwriting recognition. Apple went crazy hyping how great the handwriting recognition was. It didn't work that great at first, which led to all kinds of jokes. There's a great joke on The Simpsons. We'll come back to that later. So the early hardware from General Magic was really slow. The competitors that met them on the market also had problems, which just contributed to this wide impression that these new fangled handheld computers, they're a flash in the pan, they're not that great. And then a new kid on the block shows up, Palm. And Palm had the very practical, very grounded realization that as cool as the Newton was, and certainly as cool as General Magic stuff was, the physical devices just weren't up to the task at that point. So Palm launched the Palm Pilot, which was way, way simpler than anything General Magic was doing, but it was quick and it would run for a month on a couple of AA's and it was cheap. And Palm completely obliterated the market for PDAs for a long time, these personal digital assistants. So, sad trombone sound here, General Magic collapsed. They could not get to a point where they could demonstrate the vision that they had cooked up, and the company, they clung on to reality as long as they could, but by the end they shut down. It says that they shut down in 2002. In reality, the company was out of business in 1998, 99. They remained a legal entity for a couple of years to honor some service contracts, but essentially they were gone by the late 90s. Now, the vision of what they had cooked up was obviously very appealing, enough so that a smart dude named Paul Allen, who is the co-founder of Microsoft, he jumped in and bought up every one of their patents and all of their designs because he knew there's something to this. Even if the world isn't ready for it, there's something to it. Now, I keep talking about the world not being ready for it. That loss of focus at General Magic was their greatest blessing and their biggest curse, because they became what we now think of as a technology incubator. They didn't set out to be an incubator. They set out to make products that people would want to buy. But what ended up happening was they either created or developed or refined a list of technologies that is honestly kind of staggering. The abundance of funding that they received early on and the lack of any real direction or managerial oversight made them the most fertile breeding ground for advanced technology the world's ever seen. It's really kind of astonishing when you look at the things that came out of General Magic, the concept of cloud computing, which is my career now, the idea of little applications that you tell them to do a task and they go off and do it and only come back to you when they have the results. What we think of nowadays as something like, I'm not going to say the name out loud or I'll wake up all your phones, but that little dingus in your pocket that you can talk to. You think about things like USB, something that we take for granted on every modern device in one format or another. That was born at General Magic. It's called Magic Bus. And it later got rebranded into what we think of as USB today. Portable touchscreens, they existed before General Magic, but nobody had ever built a pocket-sized viable product with them before. Nobody had ever built an intuitive, beginner-friendly operating system designed for touchscreens on a pocket-sized handheld device before. They created the concept of interactive multimedia email for handheld devices. They had online multiplayer gaming for pocket devices years before anybody else. They had patents for streaming TV. Why? They weren't selling a streaming TV box, but again, they could not find a direction, so they went in every direction all at once. And they even invented the idea of mobile shopping from handheld devices. They had a whole system sketched out where you could walk into a store, see a product on a shelf, tap the number on your Magic Cap device, and it would be paid for, and you could walk out the door. You can do that at an Apple store right now. That idea was born at General Magic. But more than all of this cool advanced tech, the core of all of these stories that I'm telling today and the heart and soul of all of the devices on this table, it's the people. The people are the legacy of all of these stories. And so when we look at the legacy of General Magic, their golden age was only a couple of years. Like, they were only a viable company for a few years, but the number of brilliant, innovative thinkers and creators who worked there in the space of just a few years, it's kind of astonishing. This is an incomplete list coming on screen right now. Mark Peratt, he already came up earlier in that slide talking about what their vision was. He is a successful entrepreneur. He's launched over half a dozen successful companies. Andy Hertzfeld worked there. He was one of the original brains behind the Macintosh. After General Magic, he went over to Google and helped create Gmail and Picasa and Google+. Susan Kare, I already mentioned before, she is, I think, almost undoubtedly one of the most influential artists in human history. People talk about Monet and Picasso and Da Vinci. Susan Kare should be in that same category if we're measuring by the influence that people have had. After General Magic, she worked at Next. She went to Microsoft, where she designed the solitaire cards that everybody has wasted time playing when they should have been doing work. She later worked at Sony and Motorola. She worked at Facebook. She designed the thumb that we all click when we like something on Facebook. Susan Kare designed the interface for Pinterest. She designed products for the Mint. And the last big thing that I could find that she worked on, she helped design Pokemon Go. So when you see kids wandering around town, when you see my son walking into a lamppost playing Pokemon Go, you have Susan Kare to thank for that. Joanna Hoffman left General Magic, went back to Apple, and ran their international marketing division for years. Tony Fadell worked at General Magic. He later joined Apple and led the project that created the iPod. He created or led the project that created the iSight webcam that's in every Apple device nowadays. He led the first 3 generations of iPhone, and then he left Apple and went off and started his own company called Nest that does the interactive thermostats. So another amazing creator. Andy Rubin, he was at General Magic and took the ideas that were started there and left and started a new company called Danger Incorporated that created a little gadget, a handheld phone called the Hip Top, if anybody remembers that. It was pretty successful for a few years. But then hip hop kind of faded out, and he joined Google and created Android. So another world changing development there. Piero Denmar, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he left General Magic, thought, man, it would be kind of neat if you could buy and sell stuff on the internet, started eBay, which is currently valued at $28.5 billion. Kevin Lynch left General Magic and became the chief technology officer of Adobe, and then joined Apple and led the development of the Apple Watch that I think a lot of us are wearing today. Steve Perlman was at General Magic. Nobody even knows what he was doing there. There's a joke in an article I read that he might have been like the janitor, but he left General Magic having come up with this idea, like, wouldn't it be neat if you could watch TV on the internet? So he started Web TV and then later sold that to Microsoft for $500 million. And then Megan Smith was at General Magic for a while. She then joined Google. She led the project that became Google Earth, Google Maps, and Picasa. And then when she got tired of working for Google, she went and became the first female chief technology officer of the United States of America under President Obama. So when I say that General Magic changed the world, even though nobody's ever heard of them, I'm really not kidding. They are a fascinating story. Definitely check out the documentary. It's on streaming platforms. It's a heck of a story. So the reason that you care about the story of General Magic is the reason you care about any of the stuff we're talking about today. Failure isn't the end of the story. Failure is the beginning. Failure is where things get interesting. And that leads us to the last story of the day. Let's talk about next. Let's talk about the roots of what we all take for granted today in a lot of different ways. So again, all of these stories are tangled up. Silicon Valley is a small place, and you really learn that when you start doing a little historical research. There's so many people that all crossed paths at one time or another. So in 1981, we touched on this a few minutes ago, Steve Jobs led that project that became the Macintosh, which really kicked off the age of graphical interfaces for computers. Yes, the concept was born at Xerox, but Apple and the Mac really brought that into the world. In 1984, the Mac debuts, and critics love it. Everybody loved the Mac, but it wasn't a really big runaway product at first. The Apple II was outselling the Mac like 100 to 1 for a long time. And so it didn't really take off very quickly, which led to Steve Jobs resigning from Apple, or maybe getting fired, depending on which version of the story you like. But of course, Steve Jobs was Steve Jobs, and he wasn't just going to go sit on a beach drinking Mai Tais all day. So as soon as he left Apple, and another version of the story is before he left Apple, he poached all the best engineers, and then he left and he started a company called Next Incorporated. The name being a almost literal raised middle finger to his former bosses at Apple. And he said, let's do what's next. Apple's old news. Let's do something bigger and better and more interesting. So Next is this new company. And instead of building products for consumers, you, me, moms and pops, Next is focused on what was then an underserved market: academics, scientific researchers, medical institutions, institutes of higher learning, places like Golden Gate University. And they said people in those environments need bigger, better, more powerful systems. They need stuff more than what a normal consumer would need when they run down to Sears and buy a new computer. So Next computers were built on really advanced technologies. They used magnetic optical storage in the era of big floppy disks. They had built-in high-speed Ethernet networks in the era when most people didn't even have dial-up yet. They had million-pixel displays in an era when most displays were pretty chunky, low-resolution affairs. And rather than running an off-the-shelf operating system, Next also created their own operating system called Next Step. And Next Step was wildly ahead of its time. Again, we're talking late 1980s here. First off, Next Step was built on top of an older operating system called Unix, which is what most of those giant mainframes we talked about earlier were running. Heck, today, most giant mainframes still run a version of Unix. And Next Step took that Unix layer and built a really nice interface on top of it. Next Step was built for high-speed networks. It was that idea that a computer is good, but a million computers talking to each other would probably be better. NextStep had the first online app store in the early 1990s. You could connect your Next computer to the internet and install new software from the internet. That was pretty revolutionary. And NextStep was designed to be a programmer's dream environment. Steve Jobs knew that launching expensive new computers with an unknown operating system was really risky. And so he and his team figured out pretty quickly that the odds would be better if it was a place, if it was a platform that coders wanted to create really cool applications for. So every Next computer came with like an enormous trunk of books and CDs and disks containing all of the programming tools. They gave it away to anybody who wanted it. There's kind of a new concept at that point. And NextStep was portable. Now, this portability is interesting. It just means that NextStep could be easily converted to run on one kind of a microprocessor or a different kind of a microprocessor. And that doesn't seem like a big deal. And in all honesty, that was true only because Next went years before they figured out which chip they wanted to use. So their coders were like, well, if you guys can't figure out what hardware we're even coding for, we'll just make code that'll run on anything. That ended up being really important later. We'll come back to that. So I mentioned a minute ago that NextStep was a programmer's dream environment. Let's look at just a little sliver of stuff that was created on Next, even though it wasn't necessarily intended for people to use on Next machines. So it was not a gaming platform. Nobody bought a Next computer to play video games, but because it was such a great environment for doing coding, some really popular brand name games were built on Next computers. Doom and Doom 2, Quake, Strife, Heretic, Hexen. These are franchises that are still going strong today. I just downloaded a new version of Hexen to my Nintendo Switch a couple of weeks ago. These are still current game franchises that were born on Next Black hardware in the early 90s. But of course, it wasn't all fun and games. This was a platform that Next was selling to scientists and researchers and government institutions. And so it's also where a platform or an application suite called Mathematica was born. Show of hands, anybody ever heard of or used Mathematica? Cool, so you guys are smart. Mathematica is a wildly complicated thing, but it's like, imagine if a calculator had a brain the size of a planet. That's kind of what Mathematica is all about. And along with that, there was also another little product or project started on Next computers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this one. We could do a show of hands if you want, but the World Wide Web. There's a gentleman named Tim Berners-Lee. He's now Sir Tim Berners-Lee. If you invent the web, you get a knighthood, I guess. But he created the World Wide Web on a Next cube, awfully similar to the one at the end of the table right there. This is the first web server in history. It's even got a sticker that somebody tried to peel off, but it says, "This is a server, please don't pull it down." That was the entire World Wide Web for a while until he convinced other academics to hook their Next machines up to it. And this is now in a museum in Switzerland today. I would argue, like, maybe I'm hyping things, I get excited, but I would argue that this is an artifact of human history right up there with the Gutenberg press. If you think about the ability for human beings to communicate and share knowledge, it's hard to argue that this isn't right up on that same level. But of course, this is a series focused on how things went wrong and what we can learn from that. The story of Next is a story of continuous and repeated struggles. So in 1993, they realized that the value of the company was in their software. NextStep was the thing. They were losing money hand over fist trying to sell this incredibly beautiful, intricately designed hardware. So they bailed on their hardware business and they said, great, we are Next Incorporated. We are a software company now. Please, please, somebody buy our software. Somebody bought their software, a little company called Apple. Apple in those days, in the mid 90s, was in a terrible, terrible jam. The world had largely moved to Microsoft Windows. Apple's Macintosh platform was still going, but mostly only interesting to diehard Apple fans, people who identified as not liking Microsoft more than how much they loved Apple. And the Apple Macintosh operating system was really outdated and it was creaking under its own weight. Everybody who used a Mac in the 90s would laugh about how often they would crash. So when Apple needed a new operating system, they started looking around and, hey, what do you know? There's this little scrappy company 2 blocks away selling the most advanced, most stable operating system anybody's ever seen. And oh, it happens to be run by a guy we already know. So Apple bought Next, but in the course of purchasing Next, all of Next's executives took over at Apple. So it was sort of an acquisition that remade Apple as a company. And Steve Jobs became an interim CEO and then never gave up the interim CEO role and just became full CEO. So immediately after purchasing Next, the combined Apple and Next teams started working to smash the platform that Next had built, that Next Step operating system, together with the Macintosh interface and look and feeling that Mac diehard people loved. And that led to the creation of Mac OS X. If you jump on the internet and you fire up the Wayback Machine and you look, or if you come to one of our future events and use an old Mac, if you use the first version of Mac OS X that shipped in 2000, 2001, it's Next Step. They changed the color scheme. Otherwise, it's pretty much just Next Step. It's amazing how similar it was. They had to make some changes, but not as many as you'd think. And of course, OS X became the fuel that started to bring Apple back from the edge of collapse. That led to 2007, when Steve ran up on stage and unveiled the iPhone, which, if you go to YouTube and you watch a video of that first unveiling, when he talks about the iPhone, it's a widescreen iPhone. It's a great cell phone. Excuse me, it's a widescreen iPod. It's a phone, and it's a breakthrough internet communicator. That's how he described this thing. The next thing he says is, and it runs Mac OS X. That's how you know it works right. So pretty soon, they've got computers running OS X. They've got iPhones running iPhone OS, which is itself OS X, which is itself built on Next Step. And so now we find ourselves in the modern world. So again and again over the past hour, I've used that word failure. Next was a failure. Next came up with a product line. They could not sell them. It's estimated that altogether, Next never quite sold more than 50,000 computers altogether. When you compare that against even a small time player in the 90s, it's chicken scratch. It's nothing. But their vision was so strong, and what they built on the software side was so powerful from a fundamentally world-changing architectural level, that now we're living in a world where, as best I can tell, the most accurate number I could find, as of last year, we were at just under 2 billion active iOS devices in use on this planet. Every one of them, including the one on my wrist and in my pocket, and maybe in a lot of your purses and pockets too, every one of them running an operating system that was based on Mac OS X, which itself was based on Next Step, which is running on that imposing black cube sitting on the desk over there. Another way that you can kind of think about what this means. When Apple bought Next in 1996, Apple was struggling. I don't know if you guys remember, Apple was not always in the position they're in today. There's a famous issue of Wired magazine that had the Apple logo on the cover with a crown of thorns on it, and the heading was "Pray." Like, they were in serious, serious trouble. And so they took every dollar they had. They spent $429 million to buy Next. Apple bet the shop on Next Step as a platform. Today, Apple earns, or in revenue, Apple brings in $429 million roughly every 5 hours. And that is revenue fueled entirely by the groundwork laid by the engineers and creators and designers that built the machine on the end of the table. So if that isn't the ultimate takeaway here, failure is not where things end. Failure is where things begin. That's been true in my life. I imagine you've all had an experience like that too. And when you look at the world we're in today, the next time you fire up your phone, you sit down at home to watch something on TV and it's streaming over the internet, you do a FaceTime call, you download an app, you fire up your portable computer that actually fits under an airplane seat. Think about every one of those innovations was born on top of somebody's best intentions that didn't always go the way they wanted to, but the story did not stop. Failure is not the end. That's the end of the show. I hope you'll all stick around. So actually, let me pause for a moment. Are there any questions in the chat? I know that that was a possibility.
One second.
Oh, hey,
Yes.
yeah, just hang on one moment.
So there are a couple in chat, but there's one person in the room that I'll jump to first. Here you go.
Well, you talked of Mathematica, and I thought this MATLAB is very popular currently. How does that fit in? I mean, what is the logo? Who led it? Any clue to it?
Yeah, I think the question is, how does Mathematica relate to MATLAB, which is a contemporary product that's kind of in the same ballpark? I don't actually know. I'm not in the scientific research world, so I don't know. My general understanding is that they're comparable tools, but I don't know about them. It's certainly popular. I don't know anything about it, and I've heard of it. So yeah, you're not wrong. Did you have a question back there?
Yeah. So first I'll start with a comment from Chris. And I think it's just, they're really appreciative of you framing the word failure from the very beginning. And I'm glad that you ended with the same sort of concept, that it's just the beginning. And then I'll jump to Dennis, that just wants to ask if you can comment on what eventually happened to the Palm Company.
Could you repeat?
What eventually happened to the Palm Pilot Company?
Oh gosh, the Palm Pilot. I should have brought one. We have one at home. The Palm Pilot. That is another sad tale of woe. They could probably end up in next year's version of the slideshow. Palm had tons of great ideas too. The platform was wildly successful. Anybody ever have a Palm device? Yeah, a lot of hands going up. Everybody had a Palm before nobody had a Palm. Palm got bought out. They spun off a second company called Handspring that made better palms than Palm made. Then Palm bought Handspring. Then I think HP bought Palm. Then somebody else bought HP. I don't know. It's been a mess.
All right.
Rest in peace, Palm.
Rest in peace, all of them. Also, Chris would like to know, what was your first computer that you've ever played with or perhaps loved? Maybe they're the same.
That is a very insightful question. Thank you for asking that, Chris. I'll give two answers. My first computer that I owned that was mine was a first generation IBM PC. It was the same one that I had on the IBM slide earlier. It was purchased here in San Francisco from Community Thrift over on Valencia for the princely sum of $40. And the staff at that store was so shocked that anybody wanted it that they literally like gave me everything that they could think to include with it. And I had used a Macintosh at a family friend's home. So that was my understanding of what a computer was. I was like 9 or 10. I got that IBM home, fired it up. There was no happy face. There was no mouse. There were no files and folders. It was just a DOS prompt. And it was very unfriendly and intimidating, but it did kind of force me to learn. You couldn't intuitively figure out how DOS worked. You had to go to the library and get a book and ask questions and learn. So I was very frustrated by that computer, but in hindsight, it was good for me. I learned a lot on it. I'm still a Mac guy though. The other answer to the question though is, any San Francisco natives in the room? Few. So, all right. Thank you, Gracie. So if you remember at Market Street and Castro back in the 90s, there used to be, I think it was a Circuit City. It might have been a Good Guys. It was a little electronic shop over there, Good Guys. And I was running feral on the streets of San Francisco as a kid, and I was desperate for time with any kind of computer I could get, but it was hard to come by in those days in the early 90s. But the staff at that shop, they're Good Guys, I think, they were really sweet to me, and they would let me come in and play on their demo units if nobody was there, and there weren't actual customers. And in the far back of that shop, in a dark corner, they had a General Magic display with a Magic Cap device, the same model that's on the table over here. And I remember it absolutely blew my mind. It was the first computer I'd ever used that you just touch the thing that you wanted to do. Like if you want a document, you touch a document. If you need to look up an address, you touch the address book. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I never forgot that. That General Magic device changed my life, even if the company didn't end up setting the world on fire the way they intended to. Any other questions? Oh, another one.
Yes, we have a few people that just basically say thank you so much from El Adam. Daniel Ramirez says thank you from Mexico. Wim as well. And then one looks like final question from L. Adam says in the early, a bit of a challenge, I think. In the early 80s, L. Adam acquired their first portable computer, a bulky but efficient brand, Hyperion. Have you ever heard of it? Mm-hmm.
I have heard of a Hyperion.
Oh.
I've never gotten to see one in person. There are not many of them around anymore. If anybody here has a Hyperion, let me know. But no, the Hyperion's an amazing, groundbreaking computer. There's just very few of them left.
Okay, I'll honor one final question because I didn't see it until just now. So Kai says, do you try to look forward to or predict the future of computing? And the second part, do you predict AR/VR will become omnipresent?
That's a thought-provoking question. I think if there's an arc of computer history, it's towards more people having access to tools that get out of their way. If you look at the evolution of stuff we talked about today in this presentation, if you look at the items on this desk, these things are brutally primitive compared to what we all have in our pocket now, but compared to what they were replacing, these were the new and improved, easier to use tools to let you be more creative. And I think that's still true today. So to answer the question about looking into the future, I don't know. I kind of hope we don't all end up in matrix battery pods fueling an AI controlled world. If history is a guide, my guess is that 20 years from now, we'll be back here doing a presentation of stuff, and it'll all be things that made it easier for people to be more creative. What I don't love right now with the AI virtual reality tidal wave that's happening is that so many of these tools seem to be designed to do the kind of work that people feel fulfilled doing. I don't want to outsource creativity to an AI. I want to outsource digging ditches to an AI. Like, let's get the AIs to do the stuff that doesn't necessarily enrich somebody's life so that people can actually focus on being more creative and more fulfilled and creating deeper connections with other human beings. I would much prefer to see that. Whether that takes the form of, robots wandering around, I don't know, but I don't love the idea that a poet is going to be put out of work by an AI that can crank out a haiku. That doesn't feel like justice, or that doesn't feel like a fulfillment of the vision of these smart people that we've been talking about today. So I hope the future is less manual labor, less deprivation, starvation, and more time for creativity, because we've outsourced the stuff we'd rather not be doing to machines that don't care to do it, don't care about doing it. Okay, thank you. I will say, just in addition, I looked up the documentary you were speaking of. It's literally just called General Magic from 2018. And just in general, do you have other presentations that you give just for others to maybe can find you, or you can pop in your email in the chat, not email, your contact information in the chat of sorts? Yeah, good question. Or email, website. We are the Retro Roadshow. You saw my family slide up there earlier. We have done presentations like this for other schools. We have a big collection of vintage technology. A few weeks ago, we were partnered up with the Park Day School, which is an amazing educational institution on the other side of the bay. And we did an exhibition of classic video games for one of their fundraisers. But mostly we're focused on just getting people the opportunity to learn about fascinating artifacts from history that they might not ever see outside of a museum, which is why we brought all this stuff here. Now, for the folks in the room, you might notice there's little flyers saying "do not touch." Those are coming off the table in a moment. We want you guys to come over and spend a few minutes, get hands-on, see what they're all about. So far, none of them have caught on fire, so so far so good. And I'm happy to chat, and my wife Sarai will help answer any questions that might come up. And thank you guys for coming. This is what we love to do.
Thank you, Huxley. I speak for everybody here and online to say I cannot wait for the next installment. I can't wait because I read everything in current events, what's going on now, and I know it's going to be interpreted in this really great way the next time that you join us. So thank you so much, and thank you, Sarai, for joining us. So thank you to the IPS team and to Marie for our initial introduction. We have a number of events coming up for Innovation and Practice Series over the next year or so. I hope that you join us. And well, everybody, welcome. For those of you who are on Zoom, you're missing a real treat in person. And for all of you in person, please join us and play with all these great things. Thank you so much, everybody.